Dr. Sharroky Hollie, thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations. I say this frequently, but this one in particular has really been a long time coming.
Well, yeah, same here. I'm glad we finally are getting it done. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And off air, we were just kind of talking about your podcast, which we'll get into later, and the whole podcast game, how it's changed over the last 5 years or so. It's nice to know there's so many out there, including yours, that they kind of just share this great knowledge for free and in a bit of a different conversational format. I'm going to do something a little bit different with you to get started than I do with most guests. I typically don't ask people sort of how they got started on this journey, but I am going to ask you that question. It's mostly because of my own curiosity. You've carved out a really important space, and I'm just interested to hear what sort of parts of your journey or experiences kind of led you to become an advocate for culturally responsive teaching.
Um, well, it's kind of like with a lot of things, you have the long version and the short version. So I'll give the in the middle version. I mean, for me, it obviously, like for a lot of people, it started as a classroom teacher and just recognizing the level of inequities. And this was, 30 years ago, the levels of inequities and just how my students were not being adequately served, and just recognizing that there was an overarching problem here that extended way beyond what I was trying to do in my classroom.
Mhm.
Um, and so that really began. That's where it began for me, and I was able to make adjustments in my classroom and have some success, and just felt like I could have a farther reach um, based on that success. So I got into teacher education, professional development, and just saw the power of what we were doing, especially here in Los Angeles. At a time, it was with a program called the Language Development Program for African American students, that then became known as the Academic English Mastery Program, and it was totally focused around linguistic responsiveness. It
Mhm.
was helmed by Dr. Noma Lemoyne, who's my chief mentor and really kind of taught me everything that I know. And so in working with teachers in LA Unified, I saw the power and the impact that we were having, but also I thought it could be done on a larger level, which led me then to, begin to do the work at the university, and then eventually have more of a national reach once I started authoring books. So I've sort of just followed the lead, if you will, and the lead being just wherever
Yeah.
the work is taking us based on our success. But it really all started in Watts when I was teaching at Charles Drew Middle School, and I just recognized, man, our system is really, it's really in bad shape.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. I suspected it would be, I know a little bit about your work and your journey, but I suspected it would be exactly that. I share with you, the times of being a teacher, and you mentioned like being able to make small adjustments in your classroom that certainly are impactful for the students that you have. There's no doubt about it. But then wanting to kind of scale, and if you're anything like me, you kind of had that bit of a, I won't call it a crisis, but a bit of a difficult sort of decision of, do I leave the classroom and sort of try to broaden my reach? Whatever I do, I need to make sure that it's having an impact on students. And you've certainly been very successful in doing that, which is great. And I love the way you talk about, you kind of like followed the work and how it was successful. Um, while a lot of people have a hard time doing that because I think they want to know exactly what the next step is, I think we need more of that in the world. And that's, I wouldn't call that in any way reactive. I think that's more kind of looking where the opportunities are to help students. Um, and of course, one of the results of this was your book, Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching and Learning. And in that, you're discussing the importance of cultural competence in education. I want to start, though, with your definition of what cultural competence is, specifically as it relates to how educators can develop and incorporate it into their teaching practices. And the reason I want to ask that question is because I think that this term cultural competence, culturally responsive teaching, is one that we're using quite frequently. And I've had this conversation a lot, but it's still pretty nebulous and I think ambiguous. And people have a hard time getting their heads around what it actually is, and more importantly, how to actually um, use it and make it happen in their classroom. So let's start there.
Sure. I'm just going to go back for a minute to what I said earlier about I've always followed the lead in this work, and because the book would be a good example. I'm not sure that a lot of people understand when you say that. What I'm saying is I never really sought to do this work, right? It was every single move that I made, including leaving the classroom, including leaving the district eventually, came based on an opportunity that was presented to me based on someone else seeing the work that we were doing.
Mm,
Right. So I didn't, for this book that this book, Cultural Linguistic Responsive Teaching and Learning, I didn't do I didn't do a formal book proposal. I was approached by the publisher, and the publisher said, "We love what you're doing with professional development. We would like for you to write a professional development book." Right.
yeah.
I never forget the day that the senior editor, she sat in my session, and after the session gave me her card and said, "We really want you to we want to write this book with you." And so that's what led to the book that you're referring
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Right. So it's hard sometimes when you're talking to younger people because they are seeking,
Yeah.
they're seeking the opportunity. And I try to tell them, like, your work will speak for itself, and then somebody will hear it or see it that
Hmm.
will then provide you that opportunity. So I kind of use it as a teachable moment. And I'm always, just kind of waiting for the next opportunity. I mean, part of even the work here was based on someone kind of reaching out and saying,
Yeah.
"Hey, we like what you're doing." So I just wanted to speak a little bit more on that. So when it comes, part of in the book in the earlier chapters, one of the first things I do, in fact, in all my sessions, is talk about we got to have clarity around the concept and terminology. So in the book, I do a sort of diagram of the historical sort of development of the term and concept, going back to what a lot of people would attribute it to is Gloria Lansing Billings, and the notion of culturally relevant teaching, and the great book that she wrote. But then it actually goes even before her, right? Of course, it can be traced all the way back until uh, you know early 60s, with two Latino professors who kind of first sort of introduced the concept. So you're right, there's a lot out there. So I'm really big on people understanding this not as one concept, but really multiple concepts under the sort of a larger umbrella.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't, and I go through the different terminology. Like I don't, I don't use the term cultural competency because I don't look at this work as skills based. And so I don't like the notion of someone being competent or incompetent around trying to have relevancy or relate or be able to relate culturally to folks, right? Um, my term of cultural linguistic responsiveness, I like to focus on it being as the verb, the verb of response and
Hmm.
being responsive. And that's what we have to do with our students in a validating and affirming way. So I sort of follow the branch of Geneva Gay work out of UW Seattle, University of Washington, Seattle. And her notion, she ends her book around the notion of validating and affirming. And I
Hmm.
sort of built on that based on the notion of I'm looking at it as an action word, and that action word is respond. We must respond to our students. And so there are other ones out there though, and I'm really big on people like we lift all our work, right? So you have Geneva Gay, you have a cultural sustaining, you have different all these different cultural competence,
Hmm.
cultural proficiency, the Lindsay work um out of Pepperdine. So I'm really big on people treating it as your brand, right? And I use the analogy of brands of coffee or brands of, whatever. people stick to their brand, and some people like Starbucks, some people like,
Hmm.
whatever, right? So I just want to do a good job of explaining our brand, which is the validation affirmation of culturally linguistic behaviors for the purpose of building and bridging them to academic and social skills. But I don't want to do that at the discounting of any other brand. I think educators need to decide, just like they decide if they want Coke or Pepsi, they need to decide
Yeah.
what brand do they want, and whatever brand they pick, that's for them. Then it hopes it points them towards being more responsive to their students.
Yeah. I really love that point of view. I think so much of my experience, at least in education, was, well, we did this for a while. It's not working the way we wanted it to do. So let's throw it out and do something else. Rather than having a menu of choices, knowing that each thing we try probably has its potential, advantages and certainly disadvantages, but we shouldn't throw it all out just to do something completely new. And so it's refreshing to hear that response from you. And speaking of response, you talking about the words of you've used the word a bunch of responding to students' needs, validation, affirmation. Um, what are in your mind right now, beginning of 2024? Not really sure where we are post COVID and all the terms that we used during that time. Where are we now in terms of the challenges that you think, the most significant challenges that you think teachers and schools are facing in creating inclusive and equitable learning environments? And how can they address those challenges effectively, sort of through the lens that you're talking about, which is this idea of affirmation, validation, and responding to their needs? And obviously, we broaden out the topic from just multilingual learners, but obviously, folks listening to this podcast are specifically interested in those multilingual learners.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super, super broad question. I think regardless if we're talking about it in the context of specifically multilingual or beyond, for me, it's really about districts or schools first just having honest, open, transparent conversation that there are some students that they're failing. And that's not like the end of the world, but that it starts with that admission, and that we have to do something about it. I think that's where it starts, and I'm not sure everyone is on that same page, because a lot of places continue to blame the community, blame students, blame, have all these different
Hmm.
reasons as to why students are failing, without, just looking at what their practice and what they're doing or not doing that maybe contributed to the under.
Similar. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Dr. Holly, but it's like really where you're going is, and just if I'm wrong here and going the wrong direction, let me know. But like where you're going here reminds me very much of conversations I've had about implicit bias, where it's really, really hard to look at the mirror and recognize that there are some things that you're failing at and learn to correct. Is that like the same sort of idea that you're talking about here, recognizing that you're leaving some students behind and
Yeah,
dealing
I
with that?
mean, I mean, I think implicit bias certainly requires that introspection. What I'm saying is more institutional though, and more
Mm, yeah.
system, systems based. Um, Implicit bias I see as more individual.
Yep.
What I'm saying now is more systems, more, and then, after that recognition, it's about, I think, understanding that there's no magic bullet. And a lot of districts are looking for the silver bullet. That's what I want to say. There's no silver bullet. A lot of districts are looking, and so they got like, oh, we're doing this program, or we're doing this initiative, or we're doing this curriculum. But at the same time, we know that there's no one size fits all, right? And so you have to have variation, you have to have modify, you have to have customization. You need to find different ways to reach different students. And a lot of people, they just get locked in on one thing, and then that's it. So I'm really big into a sort of multi-pronged approach, um, that can serve all students in different ways, right?
Yep.
Um, so for me, it's about that recognition. Then it's about a multi-pronged approach, and then I would throw in lastly, um, you know, quality is part of what I call a feedback loop. Um, the professional learning, you know, how people are sort of supported, meaning, you know, supported and then given technical feedback, right? A lot of districts, they just do the PD and then they just say, okay, go do
That's
it.
it.
And
Yep.
be
Yep.
happy, right? You know, and like, so for me, the answer really lies more in the infrastructure and than it does necessarily in the intervention, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. And so a lot of things don't succeed. And I'm saying for my work in particular, it's not because of our work necessarily, it's because the infrastructure is not in place
Yeah.
to see it through. So right now, as we go into 2024, my focus is more on the institutionality, the infrastructure of it, more so than the individual, because I think at the individual level, we are having a lot of success when you think of things like implicit bias.
Yep.
But it kind of puts me back to where I started. Like it's one thing to be sort of a singular entity in your own classroom making a difference, which I do think we're having impact in that regard, meaning classroom by classroom by classroom.
Sure. Sure.
But when you try to scale it, that's where it becomes problematic.
Yeah, yeah, it's siloed. I mean, there's these great things happening in these individual classrooms that aren't really being amplified. Or the other way to look at it, the way that I think that you're talking about, is there's no infrastructure to kind of support it or to cradle it. I really love that infrastructure term and description. We see the same thing, with I think Elevation's product sometimes, and I typically don't talk about them on the podcast, and that the goal here is really to state a point rather than to pitch products. In fact, what I'm about to say probably doesn't sound very good, but what happens is people try to buy it, for a magic bullet, but if that, or a silver bullet, I would have said the same thing. Is that the infrastructure is not there to make it happen? So I think so many times, and we're seeing this now, sort of with, there's a lot of talk about ESSER funds and that money ending, and the fear that I have is, I've been in the position where, as a teacher, my department chair came up to me and said, "Hey, we have all this money. We have 1 week. What can you do with this money and go buy something that's going to be useful?" There's no infrastructure in place. It's just me as an individual teacher trying to think about, all of a sudden, long term, what we need. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up, because those are conversations, I think, they're happening right now around sort of funding issues and how you set up those infrastructures. What is that, out of curiosity, what does that work look like to you as you think about 2024? Because I think that's probably a little bit more difficult than creating a philosophy or a product or a tool that can help get individual teachers to where they are. How are you thinking about infrastructure and sort of infiltrating systems to make it better?
Right, right. Well, my work has always been about trying to influence the way schools do their professional learning and the way individuals teach in their classrooms. And so we've always been about that. I mean, it's akin to, a lot of people know about professional learning communities, PLCs,
Hmm.
and trying to make this sort of part of that functionality, meaning that you have ongoing conversations, you have professional collaboration, um, and so we do what in the old days they would call like a critical friends group model,
Yeah, I remember that.
where groups of teachers try, kind of sort of do this work together and sort of form a community around it, and then hopefully that can expand to other staff. So we do great in terms of these big professional developments. I've done whole districts, whole schools, but our goal has always been to get to the point with the district or school where we're developing critical friends group. That's been my goal, in the 20 years I've been doing this. But when you do that, then which I like, but it's hard work and it's frustrating. It automatically challenges the infrastructure because you're asking for professional development time. You're asking for teacher leads for
Hmm.
facilitation and collaboration, right? And then all of a sudden you find out, well, like there's a district I'm working with right now. They don't have any time in their PD calendar
Yep.
for a critical friends group like set up. So then it's a scramble, like, are we going to pay the teachers on Saturday, or they're going to come after school? And then things get really, really murky after that, right?
Sure.
So I tell people all the time that this work should kick up dust if you're doing it authentically, right? People should see where there are sort of holes in their boat that they need to fill if they're truly, truly going to be having equitable practices.
Yeah. I love that. Kicking up some dust. Yeah. I mean, you're working within a system that is really hard to change. And that becomes very recognizable, I think, when you rock the boat a little bit or try to innovate some. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit because I could definitely go down this systems and infrastructure road for a long time, but I have some other things I want to ask you about. I want to shift over a little bit to language and its impact on learning, which as you talked about earlier today, earlier in our interview, that's an important part of your work. Um, in your view, what role does language play in fostering equity in education, and more importantly, and I think this is the important part of the question, how can we as teachers and educators and people in the system to advocate for that in our schools and communities? And I ask the question because I think there's an idealistic version that we are all teachers of language and that is really happening. But when you go into schools, you realize that there are holes in professional development, teacher preparation, that really aren't allowing that to happen. So, what is it that needs to happen in order to make language really play a role in fostering equity?
Um, you know, there's several ways I could answer this question. I think that I will use what I call that language needs to be looked at as culture.
Mm.
And I don't think that in a lot of places it is. It's sort of separated out.
Yeah,
And
you hear it all
we
the time: language and culture, right? You don't hear
right,
them
exactly.
more in the same breath.
Right, because it's sort of separated out. I think obviously language is inextricable from who you are. It
Sure.
is who you are. I mean, there's probably nothing more essential to who a person is than the language, right?
Hmm.
Yet I think we've treated it in a very isolated way. Um, that literally I've seen cases where teachers are maybe looking at a student, you know, in this sort of terminology of like Spanish speaking or Spanish speaker versus who the student is culturally or ethnically.
Yeah.
That sort of comes. So for me, it's this sort of false separation of language from culture that's contributing to some of the inequity because our system feels like we can sort of, treat the language, if you will, but we don't have to treat the culture. And
Mm.
I think that's a mistake, right? And I see it honestly, a lot of it in what's this movement around dual language and dual, the immersion, right? All of those things that we're kind of doing, especially here in LA. It's very isolating with that,
Hmm.
and on top of that, I don't think we see multilingual students as an asset.
Yeah.
That it's still seen as like it's a problem that we
We
have
got to
to
fix it. We
address.
got to make sure you speak
Right,
English.
right.
Yeah.
Versus, to be bilingual, to be multilingual is, like total badass, right? It's total, right? It's an advantage, it's an asset, but our system doesn't treat it like that. And so we still have a lot of mindset issues, but the skill set part, does the language we use in our world, the skill
Mhm.
set part, meaning the programs and the approaches, and here are all the 17 different techniques, far outweigh where the mindset is
Yeah.
around how we approach multilingual students. And I think we need to do more mindset work with educators of multilingual students. The thing is, when I do like EL sessions or bilinguals, like I did, not to put them on blast, but I did the Washington Association of Bilingual Education last April. I was their keynote speaker, and the first thing I say to those groups is you're sort of supposed to be the ones that are the choir members, if you will, right? You've supposedly bought in, but I want to really challenge that by asking you within your sort of EL world, right? How culturally responsive are you?
Mm.
And it goes up, and I'm sort of like, I could have tomatoes coming at me at any moment.
No, this is what I try to do. You mentioned choir. I feel like the first 100 episodes that we do, I've done like 250 of this podcast, we're preaching to the choir every time. We need to challenge that. That's a part of what we're trying to do. So keep going.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's what I do. And it's when I've been in those environments, when I am with the choir members, bilingual organizations, state organizations, the challenge of saying, hey, wait a minute, are you really like really are you being do you have a sense of equity with your students, or are you just satisfied to say like I'm in bilingual ed or I'm in
Mhm,
multilingual and like that's enough for you? And
mhm.
people have appreciated that challenge, have appreciated me raising that question. And I think we need more of that in terms of on that mindset attitude piece. But we tend to get more of the strategy, technique, do this, do that.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. And I think, the strategy and technique, or the skill set work that you call, so easier to do, easier to build, easier to measure, easier to implement. Whereas the mindset work has always been really tricky. And that's why I challenge a lot of my colleagues who are coming in and maybe have a little less teaching experience or no teaching experience to really examine the idea that, is it really true that all teachers are teachers of language? Does everybody share that mindset? I mean, going back from where you are talking about these dual language programs where people are in the work and doing the work, we have, and this kind of leads into my next question, we have probably a large contingent of educators who, again, don't necessarily have the professional training or the preparation work to be able to really successfully work, to even have the skill set. And so the mindset, might even be lagging as well. But then you have this group of teachers, many of which are listening to this podcast right now, who are real advocates, who want to push the system, the ones that you talk to who really appreciate the challenge that you laid out to them at the Washington Association of Bilingual Education. What advice do you have for those people who are really need to be the change makers, who are encountering challenges or resistance or skepticism, or maybe they're skeptics on their own, like you mentioned? Um, what how can we equip them, or what advice do you have for them when we're trying to implement culturally responsive teaching practices in their classrooms or their schools or on a wider scale? What do they need to do? I mean, you mentioned that that's the choir. What is it that we need from them?
Well,
And by the way, let me just back up and say like, I'm not, I should, there's a little, I'm not saying that those teachers need to be doing more, like that they're not doing enough. I'm not saying that at all. These teachers, I mean, everybody's ultra busy. There's so much going on. My question is more in the spirit of, what sort of can they do? What tools can we equip them with to help them do the work that they want to do, but they may not have the time, the resources, or frankly, at times the energy to do it?
yes, certainly. I mean, what I normally tell the choir is this. It's sort of you have to be it, right? Modeling is the number one way to influence, to let people see you in action in your classroom, in meetings, and just sort of be what we're wanting others to be, right? Um, you know, for me, that's the number one. Number two is you can't be the only crazy one, if you will. So, you got to get a team, you got to get a posse, you got to get a group that shares your sort of perspective, not only in approach but also in action. When you have just one or two, then they come off crazy, and
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah.
people look at you like you're the one who's like tripping, right?
I've been there, and
Um,
I'm guessing you have too.
yeah, absolutely, but I realized like I can't be the only one because then I will get isolated. I think that the third part of it though is that you got to understand politics and know how, like, who are the leaders or folks that you can go to help with that politics, that because this at some point it does become political in some cases, in
Hmm.
a lot of cases. But so therefore you got to know, like, who's that assistant principal, or who's that, person in the bilingual office, or that you can connect with to kind of push that button when it needs to be pushed. um and then the last one, and I'm really big on this since COVID, is when you know someone is a naysayer or resistant, just leave them alone. Like, I'm not for chasing these folks anymore. We did that pre-COVID. One thing that comes out of COVID is, listen, if you're gonna take that stance, hold on to that stance, then we just need to know, and we're kind of gonna rally around ourselves around this work. I think we spend too much energy on people who don't believe in this work, trying to convince, persuade.
Yeah.
So I've been telling my choir members, let's stop wasting energy on them. And
Yeah.
let's just put our energy towards people who are on the fence, people who, feel like we can have influence and move. I tell staffs, if you can keep that naysaying group under 15%, you should still be able to go forward with this work in a positive way. Our system has spent too much time on that 10 to 15%. So I call that group the control group, and we're going to let them just go ahead and do their thing, and we'll be the experimental group, and
Yeah.
let,
Yeah.
let's do some research to see what outcomes we get.
Yeah, I love that, the control group, and this idea. It's probably good advice. Your fourth piece of advice is to let them do what they're going to do. It's probably good advice for almost anything in life. Don't spend too much time on that. And then the reality of how, keeping it under 15%, 15% or under makes sense too. Um, I could ask a whole bunch of questions about that, about how you go about doing that, but I won't. I'll sort of restrain myself. Um, I do want to highlight though the third thing you said, which I think I have a cold, so I put myself on mute and coughed, and I think you said you got to understand the politics.
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of people won't say that. I feel like that's a bit of a like, nobody really wants to talk about it, but it's there. And in order to make change, you need to be able to do that and find those folks who are able to make changes. And that's where that ground up approach can be successful. It's not going to be successful, like you mentioned, if I wrote that down. You can't be the only crazy one. I've never heard that before, but I've felt it many, many times. And if you are, you're going to be the group that's, or the person or the two or three people who are left behind. So really good advice, really good ways of putting it. Um, all right, I want to. So we've kind of circled around and brought up professional development a few different times. We've talked about PLCs, critical friends groups, establishing communities. Um, so I think we understand the kind of the role that professional development has in promoting culturally responsive teaching. But what specific elements or components make this kind of professional development successful and effective? Like you mentioned, it's not a situation where some expert comes in and then says, okay, go for it and make it happen. You mentioned infrastructure. You mentioned PLCs, critical friends groups. I guess what I'm interested in hearing is like, how do we bring all of those things together to create a system that's going to eventually be self-sufficient, or does that even exist?
Um, I mean, I don't know. I mean, when you frame it like that, I think that I think it does exist, I guess, to answer your question. Um, I've always just looked at it from the perspective of we have to have quality professional development, regardless of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And quality for us is putting the teachers in the position of being learners, so they can have a sense of, if this is what it feels like as a student, then I want this for my students. And a lot of professional development, as teachers sometimes say, is like, I'll never do this with, we're the professional development is supposed to be about interaction, and there's nothing interactive about the
Yep.
professional development,
Yep.
right? So that's just kind of like, the second thing is, like, we have to treat our teachers as professionals, appeal to their sort of intellect, You know what I mean? It's not watered down. It's not, you know, piecemeal. And I think that's very much respected and appreciated, that the professional learning is treating the teachers as professionals and
Hmm.
appeals to their intellect. And then the third thing, again, where I think it becomes an infrastructure issue, is providing what I call a multi-phased approach to the professional learning.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, and getting away from the one and dones, the two and throughs, because if anything we could say have, and it hasn't worked, it doesn't work virtually, in person, is when you just come at it and think that you can sort of send people to a professional development for 3 hours or 4 hours or whatever one time, and then expect them to come back and be able to transfer it to practice. It's just not, it's just unrealistic, and I think should be unacceptable in today's professional development. You know, I think that districts need to make commitments to multi-phase processes that help people develop and grow.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And one of the things you talked about when you first started answering the question, which again is like all the questions that sort of ask you very broad questions, um, was if you're in a professional development and it's not something that you would want to experience as a learner, you're not going to do that for your students ever. I've been there. I think we've all been there. Sort of on the other end of things, one of the most, for me at least, one of the most impactful professional development experiences that I had, that actually was only one day, is it was a very well structured student shadowing day. I just shadowed a student all day, walked around with my high school. So I walked around to all of his classes, um, experienced what it was like to be that student for a day. And there's some work being done specifically on that for multilingual learners. I'm now forgetting the name of the. It'll come back to me, but the woman who wrote a book about this, Sonia is her first name. I'm not remembering her last. But anyway, there's a lot of work being done around that. Is that something that you've experienced ever, or think would kind of move the needle a little bit in this work, just like seeing what a student's day is like and walking around with them all day?
Um, well, I mean, I've heard of that. I think that it can certainly be a perspective that can be beneficial, I think, for some. I think teachers going to watch other teachers teach, in like a peer coaching model,
Yeah.
is is very impactful. You know, my thing, Steve, with the student thing is that Paul Gorski talks very well about this, that we do a lot of things from the student's perspective, but we don't do anything about it, right?
Yeah,
And so he,
for
he
sure.
sees it as potentially, I think he actually uses the word exploitive, right? That we're sort of like, oh, we're going to have a student panel, or we're going to follow you for the day. We see like how miserable things are, right? And the kid is kind of telling us. And then the next day, nothing changes.
Yeah.
The kid goes right back to, right? So I'm only for those things if they're going to lead to change. If they're going to lead to doing something different. It's kind of like, I think we have to be careful what we do with that information. And Gorski's point is, oftentimes we don't do anything with that information.
Yep. Totally fair. And guess what? We didn't do anything with it either. What it did for me, though, when talking about mindsets, is it shifted my mindset. It wasn't just a building empathy kind of moment. And wow, like you mentioned, like how miserable your days. It wasn't miserable all day. There were some things that were great. There were some things that, why are we sitting this whole time? And what is this, why is this teacher just lecturing to me about something that doesn't seem relevant? It just made me understand a little bit more, made me shift my mindset about the student experience. So and interesting, a total sidebar. I just came to my mind and I just thought that'd be an interesting question to ask you, but I love your response about it, because I think you're absolutely right. It's got to be, it could be a part of a larger plan, part of that multifaceted approach, but I couldn't resist bringing it up. Okay, cool. I got one more question for you, Dr. Hollie, and that is like thinking about the future. What right now, thinking about where we are and where we're going, what do you believe the most sort of critical areas are for improvement in terms of fostering equity and cultural responsiveness in education? And then, I guess more importantly, like what steps can we be taking to kind of start to address those areas?
Well, I think for all of it, if you count it, if you throw in multilingual, if you throw in you know, cultural linguistic responsiveness, and then, you know, equity in general. It's 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 about the socio-political climate that we're in right now in our
Hmm.
country. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't think that this work in of itself is political, but we are in a time, we're in a space right now where we have to really be savvy um, around what this work looks like after the presidential, you know, after November 2024.
Hmm. Yep.
And so I think that it's about, you know, as they say, you know, sort of like storing up, bracing ourselves. And my own theme for this year is like, are we going to get crazy with crazy? Basically, are we going to match the energy that we're seeing in terms of the pushback against any work around DEI, any work, you know, the whole, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment that's going on, especially in some of our, you know, some states in particular, you know, and
Yep.
versus nationwide. Like I think all of that has to be under serious consideration for anybody who is about this work. Um, and so that's, to me, that's the most urgent thing in terms of going, in terms of how we need to go forward in the immediate future. And
I was
because
kind of afraid you might
sociopolitically,
mention that first.
you know, school, you know, what's happening with school boards, you know, all of that, the funding, you know, some of the funding that's flowed over the past 3 or 4 years, as you mentioned earlier, is
Yep.
coming to an end. You know, so it's gonna, you know, this work has existed through all you know, all situations, right? And a lot of times it actually, when things happen social politically, people will say, wow, it seems like that would hurt your work. But in some cases, it has helped the work because people have fought back and they've
Yeah.
become stronger advocates. And I'm hoping that we're collectively going to respond that way again.
Yeah. I was starting to say, I was kind of hoping that you wouldn't be saying that, but I figured that you would, because I think that we could sort of bury our heads in the sand about what, you know, is happening, and what may happen come November, or we can. I think you used the word kind of brace ourselves for any potential change. Store up, I think you said as well. Hard to do now at a time when people are already so busy and teaching. You know, as we know, is a really difficult job as it is, and has been probably more so over the last 4 years. So, but really honest answer, and I think important points to make. All right, I just want to let folks know as we kind of wrap up here, because we just scratch the surface of the work you're doing, Dr. Hollie. But so, where can people go to learn more about your work? And we'll put that on our show notes as well as our blog post so people can find it.
Well, certainly, you know, the website is probably the best place to go, which is culturallyresponsive.org. Um, and that's pretty much everything is there. We're also on the social medias. Our tag is at Validate Affirm, and that's one word, Validate Affirm. We know we have a YouTube channel. And also, you know, we have a podcast, a great podcast, a fun podcast called Outrageous Love, the podcast. And it's really educators from all over the country telling their journeys in this work. I use it as a way to highlight and honor people who've been in this work and give them a platform to try to, you know, trying to say this has been my walk as hopefully as an inspiration to others. And so that's at all the available outlets wherever you get your podcasts.
Love it, love it. That's a great addition to this one too. And I think we were talking before. There's more and more of these podcasts, and people are going to them. I think for different reasons, obviously, than they go to blog posts or PD. But it's really inspirational, and I think that's really really important. So we'll link to that as well, and people can check that out. Last question: is there a book or a film or any other resource that's had an important influence on you, either personally or professionally, say over the last year or so, that you'd maybe recommend to listeners?
Yeah, you know, when you say last year or so, that's where it gets tricky.
You can, let's say, last 10 years, whatever you'd like.
Right, right. I guess all right, but you know, normally when I'm asked this question, I always just tell folks, one thing that's always been inspirational to me is anything by James Baldwin.
Mm.
Um, and he has a particular essay called "A Talk for Teachers," which is timeless. You read it today, you would never know it was written like 40 years ago,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that's one of my sources of inspiration. It's something that I actually give as a gift when people are like promoted and they're leaving like a district or something. It's like my go-to gift. The other author I'm going to mention, because this is focused around language, is John Rickford
Mhm.
from Stanford. He's a linguist, because I entered into this work around language through the lens of what I call in my book unaccepted languages, which is known in more of academia as non-standard languages,
Mhm.
such as African American vernacular or Chicano English, so on and so forth. That's how I entered into the notion of multilingualism or bilingualism, because again, the program I started with was focused on that group because their language was not being recognized in the context of multilingual, right? And so John Rickford is another source. He has a great book called Spoken Soul that really just talks about the importance of acknowledging all communities and the language that they bring, regardless of what that language is.
Great. Thanks. We'll link to both of those as well. Our ever expanding library of books. I think it's some people's sort of favorite part of the episode. And we were saying before, we always put out right before the summer a list of reads that come from podcast guests. Thanks for contributing to those. And more importantly, Dr. Hollie, thank you so much for contributing to our community here. Really appreciate the work you're doing. And like I said, it's a long time coming. I'm really glad we were able to do this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to the future collaboration. And good luck with everything you're doing on your podcast as well.
No, thanks a lot. I know it took a long time to schedule, but we got it done. So I appreciate your work, and I look forward to continuing in whatever capacity we can. And we got to give a shout out to Sandra too, by the way, right?
Yep. Yep. Sandra Madrano Arroyo, who made this connection. And more and more, it's less me reaching out to people and folks on my team saying, hey, this person's great. You should talk to them, which I have no problem with. I kind of like that.
Right.
And yeah, Sandra's wonderful. All right, Dr. Hollie, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.